Welcome to another edition of the Daily Deuce. And I am really excited to be here today. I'm John Webster with the Daily Deuce and our producer, director, John Pitt. Hey, John, how you doing?
Doing pretty good, man. How are you?
Doing absolutely wonderful. We have a special guest today, a really special guest. I am so excited. We have with us today Mitchell Northam. Mitchell has written the book, High School Basketball on Maryland's Eastern Shore, a Shore Hoops History. And as everybody knows, I'm from Salisbury. Left Salisbury when I was 9 years old, but it's still like I'm still there. Still love it. I tell people, Mitchell, if my wife wouldn't divorce me, I would move to Salisbury tomorrow. But I know she won't let me do it. But an absolute honor. Mitchell, thank you for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for picking up the book. I'm glad to hear that you liked it and flipped through it. Happy to be on with you guys.
Hey, I've been telling a lot of my friends about it. You have in this book people that I deal with. I think I told you when I sent you the message. John Putt Johnson, 1975 or 76 Pocomo State Championship team. Good friend of mine, lives right around the corner from me up here in Upper Marlboro. So he lives in Bowie. So we still talk. Didn't know about the book. I called him and told him immediately. So he has been telling his friends. He told Coach Derek over at Pocomo. So the word has been circulating. Matter of fact, I have a friend, and you're going to love this. He is a teacher on the Eastern Shore. He lives over here. His name is Gary Hughes. I'm going to call him tonight. Guess where he is a teacher at?
Where at?
Colonel Richardson.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, I'm not sure I know him, but yeah.
I think he just got there this year. I think he just came over this year.
I did donate a copy of the book to Colonel's library. Still pretty close with some of the people there. They were one of the schools that, it was kind of hard researching this book during COVID because it was hard to get in face-to-face with people and get into schools. But Colonel was one of the places where, I was able to get in there and look at some old yearbooks and scorebooks and stuff like that. So yeah, Colonel's my old stomping grounds, as you probably know from reading the book.
Federalsburg you are, and very familiar with American Corner, right?
Yeah, yep. The school in the middle of a cornfield out there.
My dad took me to a few games down there. Even when I was young and skinny, that still was a tight fit in that gym. Still was a tight fit.
Yeah. It's a cool place. I kind of, when I was in high school, didn't really think much of it. Like I said, we all kind of made fun of the fact that we went to high school in the middle of a cornfield. But, I think on the Eastern Shore, it kind of has this unique spot. It's in the middle of the shore. It's got its own history with a couple of different sports, especially in men's basketball, with Merrill Morgan and Tom Corsi and Albert Mooring, and some other great players. But yeah, now that I'm a little older, I kind of have some pride in, where I went to school and its unique place on the shore.
Man, it's a neat place, man. Colonel Richardson Colonels, a neat place, and a lot of history, how they came up with the name, because at first it was going to be South Carolina. And then a historian came along and switched it around, and you wrote it in the book how it became Colonel Richardson Colonels.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's, a couple of times in the book, there's things that I stumbled on during research or whatever. And I tried to write, as much as about the history of the place, as I was also trying to balance, writing about the players and the coaches and the teams. I get into that a little bit, with the Parkside 1999 Parkside girls team, how that school was formed in Salisbury and how they got their name and how they got their mascot, and they're green and white because their first principal was a Celtics fan.
Mr. Sarbanes.
That's right. Anthony Sarbanes. So I really enjoyed kind of delving into that a little bit, not just the basketball stuff, but the other things about the communities and the places that these schools are in.
You make a mention of that, and I have to, like I said, I love the book, and I got to give you kudos because you're so thorough on your facts and delving into details. And you mentioned Parkside. I was going to come to Parkside later, but since you brought it up, one of the unique things I liked about what you said about Parkside was the nickname, how they came up with Rams based upon the former superintendent of schools, Roy Mahaffey. You want to share about that?
Yeah. So, he passed away kind of right around the time that Parkside was being built, but he really, as the superintendent, was kind of the one that paved the way for Parkside to be built. A third high school in Salisbury. And when he passed away, the folks at the Board of Education at that time, they're like, well, let's name the high school after him. That's what they did for James M. Bennett. They named the high school after the superintendent who sort of paved the way for it at the time. But a lot of people who knew him said that, no, he really wasn't a type of guy that wanted something named after him. He didn't want his name on a building. He really wasn't that type of person. So instead they're trying to come up with a mascot for the school. And they tried a couple out and none of them really stuck. And they're like, okay, what about his initials, which was RAM? So they became the Parkside Rams, which I think is pretty cool. There are a lot of times, there's a couple schools on the Eastern Shore that are Warriors, and there's a couple Bulldogs. Sometimes we just default to these, kind of not so original mascot names. So, Parkside, not only, Rams, you don't get a whole lot of those on the Eastern Shore, but it has some meaning behind it too. And so I really like that.
That's cool. That's cool. Let me ask you this. What made you decide to write this book?
Yeah, so it was kind of a long road. When I was living and working on the Eastern Shore, I grew up there, spent most of my life there. And went to high school there, went to college there at Salisbury University, got my first job there at the Daily Times newspaper in Salisbury as a sports reporter and then a sports editor. I always thought walking into, there's big Barnes and Noble on the shore, and there's the bookstore at Salisbury University, a couple other little independent shops along the way there on the peninsula. I just always thought that there could be a book about high school basketball on the Eastern Shore. And that was mostly based on just all these stories I had heard from hanging around with these coaches, hearing stories from David Bird and Butch Waller and Derek Fuchs and, Andre Collins and Nick Purnell, just hearing all of these stories told over and over again. And I'd walk into bookstores and, there would be books about, some of the older towns and communities on the shore, mostly just filled with pictures. And there's even, I think, one or two books out there about baseball on the Eastern Shore. And there's even a museum for baseball on the Eastern Shore at the Shorebird Stadium there. But it always seemed to me like, no disrespect to baseball, but basketball just always seemed like the sport that resonated the most, that people engaged with the most on the Eastern Shore. When I was working at the Daily Times, we could kind of see the metrics behind stories that we would write. And when I wrote stories about high school basketball, the page view numbers and the engagement time, all that stuff was way up, way up over anything else I covered, whether it be high school football or Salisbury lacrosse, NASCAR, whatever it was. High school basketball, girls and boys, was at the top. So I just always thought that there was a space for that. And then, as I got a little bit older, and some of these coaches that I had covered, unfortunately, they started kind of passing away. I covered Gail Gladding for several years while I was on the Eastern Shore. Talked to Bruce Wharton a few times, who coached the Bennett team to their state title. And I just didn't want all this history to fade away as these people passed on. So I always kind of had this idea, like I said, in the back of my head of that. And then the pandemic came in March 2020. And before March 2020, I was writing sports. I was freelancing, living down here in Durham, North Carolina. I was working for NCAA.com. I was doing some work for the Orlando Sentinel, wherever I could, kind of filling in here and there, covering pro soccer, college basketball, whatever it was. Well, the middle of March 2020 hits and, sports goes away for a while. There was no sports going on, so there was no sports to cover. And so I lost my jobs. I didn't have anything going on. I didn't have anything to do. I'm just kind of wandering around my apartment trying to figure out, okay, there's a pandemic going out there. I don't have anything to do in here. What am I doing? So I did that for about a week. And then I finally, I have a bunch of books here, and I just started pulling books off my shelves and looking up publishers. And I emailed a couple of publishers about this idea that I had for a book about high school basketball on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. Super niche topic, and one of them said yes. So, I went down the road, started going down the road with that publisher, wrote a whole proposal and everything, and, went to work with them and started down the road. I got about a year and a half into it and turned in kind of my first manuscript. And the publisher I was working with wanted to cut like 2/3 of the book. And at that point, I had done most of the work, interviewed all these people, done all this research. And I just kind of said, I think that would be a disservice to all the people that I interviewed and all these people's whose stories have never been told before, to cut that big of a chunk of the book. So then I decided to, kind of cut my ties there, try to shop it around a little bit more, didn't really get any bites. And then I just kind of bit the bullet and went down the self-publishing route, which was, a lot harder, a lot more work on your own to do it. But I'm glad that I got through it, and I'm glad that it's finally out there. It's been pretty rewarding to hear from people like you and, some other folks back on the shore, Butch Waller and Andre Collins and Brian Butler and Greg Bosman, people who appreciated the book. So that's the story of how this came about.
And I shared with you before, like I said earlier, I left when I was 9, but you still can't take the Eastern Shore out of me. And the book has so many great stories, so many great memories, and you covered so many facets, not only from the boys' standpoint, but from the girls' standpoint. You mentioned Gail Gladding and the wonderful, strong team she had at Pocomoke, coaching against Barbara McCool. That was unbelievable. And then you go all the way up to Parkside with Warren White and some of the great teams he has over at Parkside. And Bruce Wharton, unbelievable job he did at Bennett, took him to a state championship. Like I said, man, I fell in love with the book. It's so funny. My wife told me, you got more gifts than just that, John. Make sure you love all the gifts, just not that book. So, but I mean, I'm just so happy. Like I said, I love all my Father's Day gifts, but this one is just so special. And my friend, I can't tell you enough how much I appreciate what you have done. I mean,
I appreciate that.
Absolutely great book, man. Great book.
Thank you.
Let me ask you this, man. When you did the book, and this may not be a question you want to answer,
okay,
is there a particular chapter or part of the book that sticks in your mind more so? And you may not want to answer that because it may slight something else, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
A particular chapter. Yeah, I mean, the one that I think I like the most, and the one that I think about a lot, is that chapter that we were talking about a little bit before we started, which is about the 1976 state final between Pocomoke and Colonel Richardson. There's a couple reasons for that. The first is, this was a story. When I first started writing this book, I had kind of a little bit of an outline. I knew that I needed to have a chapter on Butch Waller. I needed to have a chapter on the 1989 Snow Hill team, and I needed to have a chapter on the 52 Ocean City boys. I needed to have a chapter on Gail Gladding, on and on and on. This was something that kind of just came up in my research that, I had no idea that two teams from the Eastern Shore had ever met in a state championship before. Mm-hmm. So as I kind of stumbled along that and found that out, and I started digging into a little bit more, I became really fascinated by how that happened, what the circumstances were and everything else. So that's one reason why it sticks out. It's because it's the only time in history that's ever happened where two teams from the Eastern Shore went to College Park to compete for a state title, one-on-one in the state final. The second was it kind of gave me some room, like we talked about a little bit ago, to really research and write about, the school that I went to, Colonel Richardson. I write about, how the school started and how it was named. Got to write a little bit about, all, the generations of people in my family that went to Colonel Richardson, which was really cool. And then I got to dive into and talk with some really great people for this chapter. I interviewed Merrill Morgan at length for this chapter specifically, and a few others. He pops up later, and really enjoy talking to him and about his career. I think he's a guy that, when we talk about sort of the legends and coaching on the Eastern Shore, he isn't always the first name that pops up, but when he retired, he had more than 500 wins. Despite not winning a state title, coached for a long time. At the time that he retired, him and Waller were the only two on the shore who had that many wins. And
some really great players.
Yeah, had some really great players. And, whoever you talk to about him, nobody has a bad word to say about Merrill Morgan. Just a really nice guy who did a lot of great things for a lot of people and is really important to that community of Southern Caroline County. So his journey from, playing at Duke to New Jersey and then coming, to little old Caroline County, I thought was really fascinating. And then, I got to get into the Pocomoke of things, talking to Anki Tall, who has this interesting, connection to Pocomoke High School, where he played on a state title team, had a son play on a state title team, and then he coached a state title team. So, kind of a Pocomoke legend in that way. Really getting to absorb and dive into all that, which was a really new story for me. It was something I had never heard. So getting to kind of preserve and tell the history of that was pretty special.
Yeah. I really enjoyed that chapter. And the unique thing, I was at the state playoffs this year, and I was sitting with John Putt Johnson and Coach Derek and his assistant coach. And I thought they introduced him to me as Anthony. So I'm saying, Anthony, I'm reading your book and I see Anki, assistant coach, and I called John. I said, John, is his name Anthony or Anki? And he said, hey, I said, that guy's in the book, John. He's in the book. And he's got quite a history.
Yeah, he talked with me for the book, as did Coach Fuchs. Gave me some pictures and showed me an old yearbook and that sort of thing. So, yeah, some of the photos in that chapter are from him as well.
So, did you get a chance for them to go back and talk about Kerry Reese as a coach, or did you get to hear the history of him as a coach as well?
Oh, yeah. Anki talked about Coach Reese a lot, how he used to chew tobacco on the sidelines and, had a can and that he spit in, if, there's, I think it might've been that state title game. They're down big at halftime. And I think it was Anki who told me, in the locker room at halftime, he called us every word but a child of God, chewed him out real good. And I guess it fired him up, because they went on to win that game. He seemed like he was a real kind of firecracker of a character. David Bird talked about him a little bit too. David Bird got the job after Reese. He seemed like quite the character.
Wow. And from what I read in the book, he took his spittoon with him on the sideline, no matter where he was coaching. He always had his tobacco spittoon with him.
It sounded like it. Sounded like back in those days that was okay. Had a little can with him under his seat, and that's where the tobacco went.
Well, unbelievable how things have changed. I don't know how many coaches would be able to carry a little tobacco spitting can on the sideline today.
No, they don't even really let you do that in baseball anymore. I don't think they let you do it in basketball. So, but in '76, hey, times were different.
They were more fun back then, Mitchell. They were more fun. Let me ask you this: Steve Decatur, you had a wonderful chapter in there about Ward Lambert when he went there. He coached there before he went to Salisbury State, Salisbury University. Had a run of a state title with the Purnell brothers. He had Oliver, Sherwood, and Milton. Tell us about those times at Steve Decatur.
Yeah, the Stephen Decatur chapter, I was really, kind of late in the process. I was finally able to catch up with someone from that team. It ended up being Hondo Handy, who played on that team as well. And that team is really interesting and kind of holds this kind of special place in history because a lot of the starters on that team were some of the first Black people to ever attend Stephen Decatur High School. Worcester County was the last county on the Eastern Shore to desegregate its schools. So, that team, they played against, teams that were mixed like they were. They played against all Black teams like Worcester. Worcester High was still going at the time. They had Talvin Skinner, who went on to play in the NBA. He was a great player. And yeah, they have all these guys that went on to kind of do these great things. You mentioned Ward Lambert. He coached at Salisbury University for a long time. And then kind of later in the book, I get into how he kind of helped Butch Waller sort of modernize his teams and system a little bit, sort of with that UNLV kind of run and gun style. And then, Oliver Purnell played on that team. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to get up with him for the book. But he went on to coach, in college for a long time. It was a successful coach at a lot of different schools, Clemson, Boston College, DePaul, Old Dominion, and led a lot of those teams to NCAA tournaments. And, a lot of other guys on that team, played Division I college basketball. So, yeah, I think, they lost one game all year. They're definitely kind of one of the great teams that we've had on the shore.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. And I got a chance to see the Purnell brothers play at a young age. My dad started taking me to these games, I guess, when I was about 6 or 5. Mm-hmm. And I was a sports nerd, man. I just love watching that stuff, man. And you mentioned, and I again, another great chapter. You talked about the integration that happened with Worcester. They were the last Black school that integrated, and Handy and the other guys went over there to Stephen Decatur. But you also talked about the Black schools that were in the Eastern Shore. You talked about the Somersets, your Macy's Lane, your Moultons. My dad used to be a teacher at Lockerman High School up in Caroline County.
Yeah.
All those schools. Talk a little bit about us with that. I mean, you talked about Levi Fontaine. Didn't get a chance to see him at Somerset, but I saw him play at Maryland State. And what a treat it was. Saw him and Thomas Stewart play, and Jake Ford, you also mentioned, But tell us a little bit about that, man. That was fascinating.
Yeah. Those stories about the all Black high schools, I feel like that is one that we were kind of losing a little bit. I had in my time, working and covering sports on the Eastern Shore and living there, I had heard stories about all these different eras, but really hadn't heard too much about the 60s, in this era of some of these really great players and teams at these all Black high schools that we had on the Eastern Shore. Somerset High School with Levi Fontaine, they won back-to-back state titles, and they're the only boys team from the Eastern Shore to ever do that. And the only other team to ever do that, girls are boys, is Easton one with Kelly Gibson in the 90s. And Levi Fontaine, of course, went on to play in the NBA. He's the first from the Eastern Shore to do that. So I felt like telling his story and preserving, some information about those Somerset teams was really important. They actually finally just kind of got their due at Washington High School. Somerset High School doesn't exist anymore, but the high school in Princess Anne is Washington. And they finally hung up a banner for Somerset High School state championships, which is a really cool thing. Then there's, a lot of other stories from those schools. Moton, you mentioned, they had a point guard by the name of Walter Hazard, who, went on. He was a freshman starting point guard, won a state championship. Then he leaves and he moves to Philly. But then later, goes and plays at UCLA for John Wooden, and then plays for the Lakers, and then coaches at UCLA. Walt Hazard is someone that I knew of, but I had no idea that he had ever spent time on the Eastern Shore before I started researching this book. When his name popped up, I was like, is that right? Is that Walter Hazard? So that was pretty wild and interesting. And, like I said, it was really fun for me to just discover some of the stuff on my own. And I hope that people kind of have that same reaction when they're reading the book. But yeah, there's so many from those schools, Reuben Collins and Talbot Skinner, and there are a couple that are escaping me right now. But yeah, I felt like it was really important to kind of give them their own chapter and their own spotlight to kind of illustrate that era a little bit.
And you mentioned somebody that I absolutely love watching play, Reuben Collins.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, absolute treat, Mitchell. Absolute treat.
Yeah, a lot of people will point to him, and I think there's a quote from at the time might have been Washington's principal in there, said Reuben Collins was the best player he ever saw. Greg Bosman, who I talked to at length for the book, he spent a lot of time playing in men's leagues on the Eastern Shore, after his college career was over. And he just spoke so highly of Reuben Collins and a couple of these other guys. Reuben Collins, he was a great player. I wish there was like archival footage, that I could watch, or see him play.
I'm going to tell you something. That year, I was so fascinated by that team because, and this is your interview. I shouldn't even be doing this. So I'm sorry if I take your time.
Oh, you're good. Go ahead.
But they were, and my dad told me this, and it didn't make sense when I was 8 or 9. Sometimes the best team doesn't always win. That year, Reuben Collins was a senior at Washington. He came down from Philadelphia. And the starting five, this is unbelievable. I still remember the starting five: John Slade, Reuben Collins, George Fontaine, Darrell Woods, and one of the Hall brothers. I think it was Ethan Hall, not Kirk Hall. Ethan. Undefeated the whole season, Mitchell. Undefeated. Get to the championship game at Civic Center to see who's going to Coalfield House. And they lose. Guess who they lose to? Stephen Decatur.
Yeah.
And guess who the starting guard was on Stephen Decatur? Oliver Purnell.
Oh, right. Yeah, that team. Yeah. I lost the year a little bit, but yeah, it's
that's 72. Yeah. That's 72. And they were, to me, that's the best team that a lot of people don't know about because they didn't get across the Bay Bridge. Stephen Decatur went, and Stephen Decatur earned it. They lost to him twice in the regular season. They beat him for the game to get across the bridge. But really, the better team that year was Washington. I mean, they were unbelievable, man. Unbelievable.
Yeah, there's a lot of teams, in the history of the sport on the shore like that, that had these great runs and these great seasons. And then in the end, it just didn't work out. I wrote a little bit about a team that Butch Waller had at Y-High in 2012, 2013, and they lost at the buzzer to Edmondson on a play that probably should have been called as a charge, but the refs just kind of let it go.
That was a team with Thomas Brown, right?
Yeah, Thomas Brown, Derek Hayward, Rashawn Handy, Nelson Brown, Larry Ennis. That was like one of my first couple years covering the sport. So I remember that team pretty well. And I was sitting, right behind the basket, that had happened. But yeah, there's, Albert Moring is one of the best players ever from the shore and, never won a state title. Tia Jackson, same thing. So a lot of great players, those state titles are elusive.
And I'm hearing whispers. There's another kid at Colonel Richardson that's supposed to be really, really good. I can't remember the kid's name. I'll find out for you. But I'm hearing this kid is unbelievable.
I'll have to ask Coach Bluchek about him. Yeah.
I'm here. I heard it this past year from my friend Gary. Said this kid is unbelievable. So
okay.
We'll have to see about it.
I'd like to see it.
Let me ask you this. And I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm just going to ask you, Quentin. I'll get going and I'll take your time up. And I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Look, Snow Hill. Let's talk Snow Hill.
Yeah.
Dominance with Alan Miller as one of the great coaches on the Eastern Shore. And then you had Sherrod Mills. Unbelievable talents. Unfortunately, they both have passed. How was it for you to get the information you needed to put those chapters together about Snow Hill?
Yeah, that was, those were a couple of chapters that I wanted to make sure that, that I did a really good job on. The whole book was important to me that way. I wanted to make sure I had all my facts straight, but those two guys specifically, they're, so many people talk about them and bring their names up. And I just wanted to make sure that they kind of got their dues in the book, so to speak. Sharon Mills, I never got the chance to meet him, but he died while I was working on the Eastern Shore. So I reported on his death and, at the time was able to kind of talk to some people about him. So I had a little bit of an idea, just how good he was. Obviously, his name is still at the top of the record book for the most points scored in a state final. Excuse me, I had a little bit of an idea, how great this guy was. I just tried to cover, all my bases. The place I started was talking to Nick Purnell, who was the point guard for that 89 Snow Hill team, who played on JV under Alan Miller before he took over as the head varsity coach. So I started with him because he played with Sharon, played for Coach Miller, and then coached under Coach Miller later on. I got up with Jeff Levin, who was Alan Miller's roommate at one time, and coached with him, for some of those great Snow Hill teams and runs, and then just try to talk to a lot of other people who knew Alan Miller. David Bird was a great friend of his. David Inslee, who worked at the Star Democrat for a long time. He was a big help to me, when I was trying to write about these coaches that I hadn't unfortunately got the chance to meet, like an Alan Miller or Grayson Hurley. It was really interesting and rewarding to kind of dive into, not just the 89 Snow Hill team, but kind of what happened to Alan Miller and Sharon Mills after. Sharon was drafted into the NBA after his short stint at VCU, where he was a great player. And then, unfortunately didn't catch on ever with the Timberwolves, but did have a nice career going overseas until, unfortunately, he kind of had this freak injury happen during a men's league game on the Eastern Shore. And that sort of ended his basketball career. And then, 15 years or so later, he was diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And then Alan Miller, there's not many coaches in the state of Maryland on the Eastern Shore ever who win 3 state championships. There's not that many of them, but Alan Miller is one of them, and did it, almost in 3 different decades. I think the years he won were 89, 2001, and 2008. So, years apart, no overlapping classes, anything like that, 3 totally different teams that he won with. And then, unfortunately, he just died of a heart attack, which is pretty wild. So, I thought it was important to, like I said before, kind of preserve the history of those 2 characters, of those 2 great people that mean a lot to Snow Hill.
Let me ask you, if I'm not mistaken, Coach Miller's last game coaching was the state championship game that they played, right? Am I correct on that?
Yeah, and they lost, unfortunately, 2010.
I was at that game.
Mm-hmm.
They had a kid. I can't remember his name. You would remember his name. He scored like 75 or 80% of the points that night.
Keith Jackson.
Yes, he was a football player too, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, that kid was. He jumped the center tapped the ball to himself, ran down the court, scored the basket, stole the ball. He did everything. Sold popcorn, sold hot dogs. He did everything. I mean, it was unbelievable. He was really, really a great player.
Yeah, Keith Jackson, I actually did get to see play because we were in high school about the same time. So, when Snow Hill came to Colonel, once or twice when I was in high school, I got to see him play. And he was a legitimate freak athlete, in football and in basketball. I think Nick Purnell tells a story of one time, during a football game, he saw Keith jump over, the line of scrimmage, take the ball out of the quarterback's hands and just sprint 60 yards the other way. And I mean, dunked on people pretty regularly, was just a dude who could do anything on the field or the court.
Now, let me ask you this question. Now, this is an important question, Mitchell. Snow Hill and North Carolina were supposed to play for a Bayside Conference championship game. Did not happen because of inclement weather. Question for you. If they play, who wins?
I think Snow Hill would have won. Just like based on, all the reading that I did on both teams and stuff that year, I think Snow Hill had the more well-rounded team. It seemed like North Carolina was basically Jeff Chambers, who was a great player, went on to play at James Madison, I think is still one of their like all-time leading rebounders. But I think Sharon was a little bit better than Jeff. And I think that in terms of the team, I think that Snow Hill was a little bit more well-rounded. And then, North Carolina had the chance to meet Snow Hill in the state final, which would have been the second ever time that would have happened, but they lost in the semis. So then
they didn't hold up their end of the bargain.
Right. Yeah. So really the only time that they got to see, fans at that time got to see, Sharon Mills and Jeff Chambers kind of go mano a mano was in the Bayside All-Star game that year, which I wrote a little bit about in that chapter about Sharon. But really the guy in that game who shined the most was Tyrone Travis from Cambridge, who went on to play at Radford and overseas for a little while. He was kind of another freak athlete who could do anything. And Cambridge won a state title that year as well. They were just in a different classification than Snow Hill in North Carolina. But and, those late 80s, that was a really good era for some really great players.
I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it. But let's move on to Pocomoke. Talk about Coach Dave Bird in one era, and then his successor, Coach Derek Fuchs, in another era. Tell me about him. What are your thoughts on those two?
Yeah, it's funny. Dave Bird told me, I think it was towards the end of our interview, or can't remember which part, but he said to me, you'll notice as you go through your research and stuff that, through the years of basketball on the shore, some of the teams and some of the names change, but Pocomoke's pretty much always there, which is true. Pocomoke won 2 state titles in the 70s. They won a bunch of Bayside titles, all the way through. They won a state title in 2002, and then Derek Fuchs won one in 2016. So, they're the only Eastern Shore team that's won a state title since Alan Miller's 2008 team. Since then, the only team that's won it all was that 2016 Pocomoke team. Fuchs's teams and Bird's teams, they play very similarly. If you talk to coaches who kind of face both of them, and it's kind of been a constant at Pocomoke, the whole time, defense first, effort first. It's all about defense and intensity and effort. And then the offense and that other stuff kind of comes later. But yeah, 2 great coaches who, always get the most out of their players. I mean, that 2016 team that Derek Fuchs had that I covered, there were no Division I college players on that team. The point guard was maybe 5'5" on a good day, Tyler Nixon, but that dude was like a gnat at a barbecue. I mean, he's just in your face, annoying you, if you're an opposing ball handler. He's just in your grill the whole time. And that kid just had guts, made a mess of free throws in the state final. And then, they had a couple of, their center was this kid who they called him Fat Man. His name was LaCurtis Whitney. He kind of reminded me of Zach Randolph, but he's nowhere near as big as Zebo. He's maybe 6 foot flat, but he's playing center and he's just tough. And he's, battling with people and, making, opposing defenders and players that are much bigger than him. He's making them smaller than him, just by his toughness and his tenacity. And all those teams had it, all those Pocomoke teams, and Dave Bird was, had some great players during his time. Mike Roberts played for him in the 90s, and he's still the all-time leading scorer in the state of Maryland for public schools. And then that 2002 team, the star was Eddie Miller, who went on to Fresno State. A lot of people say that Eddie Miller is one of the best 3-point shooters to ever come around the shore. But he could kind of do a little bit of everything. But yeah, Eddie talked a lot about Dave Berg when I interviewed him, and said he'd be tough on you in practice, but when you needed him, he was there for you. He'd do anything for you. And you get a lot of that with the coaches around here. Tia Jackson kind of spoke the same way about Barbara McCool. Barbara McCool has this reputation of being this super tough coach. But if it wasn't for Barbara McCool driving Tia Jackson up and down the East Coast, she might have never gotten a Division I scholarship. So yeah, those Pocono teams are definitely important. I felt like it was important to give David Bird and Derek Fook some space to shine a little bit there in the book.
A couple things stick out for me in that chapter. One, the story that you told about Coach Bird and the kid that's the 5'8" power forward, and he couldn't play now. He couldn't play for the team. But what is he doing now, Mitchell? What is he doing now?
Yeah, that's Big Pat Dowdy. He is the public address announcer for the Charlotte Hornets, and he's been there for probably almost 20 years now. He kind of came back when the Hornets kind of came back to Charlotte. They had this open call for a PA guy, and at the time he was calling games for UMES, and heard about the Hornets opening, drove down in his old car and ended up getting the gig out of a bunch of people who applied for it. But yeah, he was really kind of set on that path by David Bird, who was just honest with him. Pat, I love you. You seem to love basketball a lot, but you're 5'8", and I don't need a 5'8" forward. So you got to figure out something else to do. So, that next semester, Pat takes the mic, from the vice principal at the scorer's table there at Pocomoke, and kind of sets him on this journey to, now he's bumping shoulders with Michael Jordan.
What a job, right? What a job. Hey, the thing that I noticed, even with Coach Derek Fuchs, teams are well-disciplined, well-organized, and they play together, and it's like a family. And I've had the pleasure, John Johnson has introduced me to Coach Bird, and I've gotten to know Coach Fuchs over the last year. And I honestly can say to you, they're better people than they are coaches. They are wonderful people. And it's a pleasure just to meet them and just to talk to them and see what they're doing with all these kids and helping them find a better way. So I enjoy them. I really do.
Yeah, I really enjoyed talking to both Coach Fuchs and Coach Bird for the book. I went down to Pocomoke, and I just sat in Dave's office for I think 2 hours with him and Coach Fuchs, and it was just a great time. I've been out to eat with Coach Bird. Watching NCAA tournament games, just hearing stories, talking about life, basketball, whatever. And I covered that 2016 Pocomoke team that won the state title. A couple months later, they, the governor came to town and presented, the two sports teams from Pocomoke that won a state title that year, because their field hockey won it too, with this proclamation or some sort of award. So I went to cover that as well. And when I showed up, Coach Fuchs had a T-shirt for me, with the Pocomoke state title stuff on it, which was pretty cool. I remember at the press conference for the state championship that year, we're in this little room at the University of Maryland College Park at the Xfinity Center there. And someone, I don't know if they were from the Baltimore Sun or where they were from, but someone who hadn't covered Pocomoke at all kind of asked Coach Fuchs this question and, about their season. And he was I don't remember what the question was, but he said, just ask Mitchell Northam. Like he's been here, he knows what's going on. So that was pretty funny. I really enjoyed covering that team. That was just a fun run that year.
Yeah, I bet it was. And Pocomoke, like you said, that they're considered Title Town, yes. USA.
Yes, they are now for sure. Chrisfield, I think, would dispute that. But Pocomoke has kind of taken that. I mean, when you talk about all the sports,
yes,
I've seen success there. Boys and girls basketball. I mean, the field hockey is unmatched, and in boys soccer as well. They've won a handful of titles in pretty much every sport.
Didn't they have a field hockey team one year that was undefeated and unscored upon? that won a state championship?
Yes. Yep. That was in the early 90s. I think that Bird's daughter played on that team. But yeah, long history of really great field hockey teams coached by David Bird's sister, Susan Pusey, for a long time.
Yeah. Now we're rolling into the guy in Salisbury, the Waller guy, Butch Waller. I know you probably could have did half the book just on Butch Waller. Tell us about Butch.
Yeah, I mean, I could have just written a whole book about Butch Waller. He kind of helped start this thing for me. I tell a story in the beginning of the book where, I'm a college kid trying to kind of figure out what I'm going to do. And, I go to this game and I'm kind of taking notes, kind of not, kind of paying attention, kind of not. And, after the game, someone, my friend's dad, Bill Weber, kind of pushed me to go over to talk to Butch, and he just treated me like every other reporter that was there. And I've gotten the chance to spend a lot of time with Butch. I always loved covering games at Y High because I could sit, the scorer's table there is on this elevated platform at center court. And I used to sit on the platform in front of the table, so you kind of see everything and you can see all the fans and stuff. And then after games, if I'm not writing on deadline or anything, I could just go in Butch's office and hang out. Him and Doug King and Bill Weber and whoever else would be in there for, 2 hours after, trying to get all the scores for the games. Butch would have all these little charts and stuff. Butch is such a meticulous and detailed coach. I think that's why he's been so successful. Interviewing him for the book, I learned a lot more about him. I thought I knew a lot about him, covering him when I was working on the shore and talking to him so much. But he really viewed, the sport that he really wanted to coach was football. And he just didn't get the opportunity to do that. He sort of got pushed into coaching baseball, and baseball came very easily to him. I write in the book about his record coaching baseball, and it's pretty unmatched. He had some really good teams his first couple of years working at Y High.
I think he coached the golf team too, didn't he?
Yeah, he coached golf as well. And yeah, he really viewed basketball as a challenge because when he first started coaching basketball, he thought it was going to be like baseball. He thought it was going to be a walk in the park once he got up to varsity. And it wasn't. It was something that he had to work on. And he kind of told himself, all right, well, maybe I won't be, the most talented coach or have the most talented players, but no one's going to out-prepare me. So that's the mentality that he has always had, and I think still has to this day. Just this really detailed and meticulous guy who, even if there's not a game, even if he doesn't have a game going on a December night, but someone's playing at Mardella or Parkside or wherever, he's getting in his pickup truck and driving out to that game and taking a yellow legal pad inside and filling out notes. So yeah, he was really honest with me during his interview. He talked about kind of how much time and how much energy he's poured into coaching basketball at Y High. And that kind of took him away a little bit from being a father to his own son at times. So that was all really interesting, and really appreciated his honesty in telling these stories. Talked about his relationship with Morgan Wooten, who, like him, won a whole lot of games at one school at DeMatha. And also like him, could have been probably lured away for some other jobs, a college, or whatever, but chose to stay at Y High. Y High was his mountain. There were no other mountains for him to climb. He's had quite a career, unmatched, like I said, for wins. He has the one state title, which I think is really important to him. I don't think he's ever going to retire. He kind of joked in the book that, one day the janitor will come in here and sweep me up with the rest of the garbage. Butch is a great guy, great coach. And, before I started working on this book and agreed to that deal with the publisher, I called him and I was like, Butch, I'm going to write a book about high school basketball on the Eastern Shore. Would you help me out with this? Yeah, definitely. It it was good for me. I felt like I needed his approval. He was kind of like I said, the Yoda of high school basketball on the shore, sort of the shepherd of it. And I felt like I needed his green light to go ahead and pursue this project. So I was grateful to get that, and I've heard some of his feedback on the book. He loved it. So all of that's been really awesome.
I'll tell you this. As a kid, I remember watching him coach. Now I can go all the way back to the 70s. Players that I know he remembers: Carlton Mack, Timmy Knapp, Harrison Strozier, Daryl Kerrigan, Marion Ennis. I saw all those games when he first started coaching, and I've always enjoyed watching Wycomico, but I've always enjoyed it. Got a thrill out of watching him, and kudos to what he's done and where he is coaching and the wins and everything. I think he's one of the Mount Rushmores on the Eastern Shore, without a doubt.
For sure, yeah. And you mentioned Harris Strozier. Yeah, those early 70s teams that he had, that was kind of his first good team, like where he kind of figured it out. He, had been in it for a couple of years, kind of felt like he had done enough preparation and, had started going to Wooten's camps. And then, he had that team with Harris Strozier, Marion Ennis, and Edwin Lashley. That was really good. The Butler brothers, Paul and Brian, they talked a lot about those teams to me for the book. Those were the teams that they grew up, watching. So, he's had players, pretty much every decade that have been pretty awesome. And he's been to the Final Four more than any other coach, has that one, but, has been there a bunch of times.
That's a good segue into the next thing I want to ask you about. That championship team, that state championship team that Y-High had, I think you took a different approach in your writing for that chapter. You went game by game to talk about that entire run. Why did you decide to do it like that for that chapter?
Yeah, so that chapter is interesting. I wrote a story it was actually the last story that I ever had published by the Daily Times before I left there to go work at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. It was the 15th anniversary of that team's run. So, I wrote a story about that team, that 2002 team, for the Daily Times. And I wrote it initially in that style, in that sort of oral history, game by game style, because I had interviewed, almost all the players, Waller, Doug King, Bubby Brown, Craig Winder, all these guys, Jermichael Mitchell, and a lot of other people who were around the team. So I had all these interviews already, but the paper, they weren't going to publish a 10,000 word whatever oral history in the newspaper. That would have taken up the entire paper. It just wouldn't have worked really. So after I reworked that into sort of a narrative kind of story for the newspaper, I held on to this oral history version that I had because there was so much of it that wasn't used. And I just held on to it. And then, I started working on this book and I was like, oh, I can use that oral history. And, I added some more stuff in and kind of refined it a little bit and kind of moved some things around. But yeah, for the most part, a lot of that stuff was interviews that I did way back in 2017 and just held on to, whenever I got the chance to use them. I figured that one day I'd be able to use it for something. So, when that opportunity kind of came along, I felt like it was good just to keep it in that format. And then I kind of did a similar format when I wrote about the triple overtime game between Colonel and Crisfield in the chapter that's about Albert Mooring, just because there were so many people who had so many things to say about this one game. I thought that was the best way to sort of get it in there.
And I'm gonna say this to you. Bubby Brown is a walking quote machine. I mean, I found some of his statements so compelling and so funny. I mean, I'll give you a couple of them. The night he scored, I think his 1,000th point, he had on Butch Waller's tennis shoes and no socks.
That's right.
And another one where he said when they beat Central for the state title, Central's one of these schools up here in PG County. He was like, he really wasn't worried about that because PG County kids aren't that tough. So I got to ask him about that. But anyway.
Yeah.
I mean,
Bubby's pretty uncut. A lot of the guys for the book, Waller too, and Doug King, a lot of them kind of took the filters off and were ready to just tell me about all these stories and all the details. So it was pretty great.
I know Butch was a little bit concerned, and it's not the first time I've heard this. Nobody over here on the other side of the bridge knows how to say Wycomico. And I know one of the writers got on his nerves anyway because he couldn't say it right and he wasn't giving High the proper respect. So
right.
It never fails. Nobody over here can say Wycomico.
It's not that hard. But yeah. Whatever it was that day, that reporter for the Washington Post got under Waller's skin.
Let me ask you this. Hard question. Again, you don't have to answer this. Who is the best player you've seen on the Eastern Shore? And also, who is the best player you've been told about played on the Eastern Shore?
The best one that I've seen in person. So that would be kind of limited to basically like 2006 to 2017. There's probably three. I would say Jordan Duffy, who played at Bennett, and just, he wasn't always on, but when he was on, and you saw it a couple times in college when he played in North Texas, he could score whenever he wanted to, behind the line, at the rim. Dude was a walking bucket when he wanted to be. At the Governor's Challenge, I think one time he scored 39 points in a single game. He when he wanted to, when he was determined, he could really, really fill it up. We talked about Keith Jackson earlier. I think in high school, he was probably, when I was in high school, he was probably the best player around on the shore at that time, save for maybe like an AJ Spencer or a Herb Dennis from North Carolina. And then I think, the best big man now, in high school, he was really raw. You could kind of tell he had some of the raw skills and instincts, but I mean, Kaveh Aluma has turned into a fantastic player.
Yes.
Yes.
Congratulations to him as well. Went in the NBA draft.
Yeah, just got picked up by the Grizzlies. He was a guy who went from, you go on these recruiting sites and he has no stars, no photo, no nothing. Nobody knew anything about this kid except for if you were on the Eastern Shore. I tell a story in the book about, how they held an open tryout day for some coaches to kind of come see him. And there was 5 Division I coaches there. One of them was Mike Young, who took him to Watford, then brought him along to Virginia Tech. There's, I think for Kaveh's career, now we have in college, the transfer portal and the eligibility, you don't always have to sit out a year. Sitting out a year was really important to Kaveh because he basically locked himself in a gym and taught himself how to shoot threes. And then he became this all ACC player. So yeah, those are probably the 3 that I'd go with as far as guys that I've seen, players that I've heard about. I think the 3 that first come to mind are probably Sharon Mills, Albert Morian, and Andre Collins.
Wow. And that's a real top 3 right there.
Yeah, I think if you asked me to pick like a starting 5 for the Eastern Shore, those 3 would probably be in it.
Ooh. I can't disagree with you.
And then
I'll add Reuben Collins in there.
Yeah. And another guy that I didn't know a lot about before I started writing this book, but David Bird and Coach Fuchs told me a lot about was Mike Roberts, who, like I said before, has the state record, for most points scored in a career. He went on to play at Colgate and played in 2 NCAA tournaments. So he had a great career and could score inside and out. It could really fill it up.
Wow. Let me ask you this, man. And it's just never enough time. I'm just so fascinated with this. Now, thank you for taking the time to talk to me. Do you have plans to write another book?
I don't right now, but I would like to write another one.
Please do.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I have a couple, kind of half-baked ideas kicking around. So once I kind of finalize or formalize something, I'd like to write another one someday.
Because you tell such a great story, Mitchell. Such a great story. And like I said in the beginning, what you tell is so important, man. So important. Last question I'm going to ask you. Hard question, but I need you to answer it. Because you talked about food earlier in the book. Best scrapple sandwich on the Eastern Shore. Tell me what you think the best scrapple sandwich on the Eastern Shore is.
I think for me, it's at Johnny's in Salisbury. Johnny's Sub Shop. If I had a runner-up, there's a place in Fruitland that's like behind Route 13. It's an Eagle Express gas station. And there's some older ladies in there who work there, and they make scrapple sandwiches. And I think they deep fry the scrapple.
Really?
So it's kind of a different thing on it. But, when I was in college, I worked one summer as a driver helper for Coca-Cola. So, we get in the truck early in the mornings and we'd go up and down 13 on the Eastern Shore and drop off Coke to all these places. And on Wednesdays, we would stop at that gas station and we'd fill up their coolers and they'd have a sandwich waiting for us. And I'm pretty sure that's what they did.
Wow.
So,
you're making me hungry, man.
That's a
You're
good
making
one.
me hungry. I need to go back down there. Now, I'll tell you the spot that I think.
Okay.
Dayton's on Snow Hill Road, I think it is. Dayton.
Yeah.
Great scrapple sandwiches. Now, both of these places need to give us an advertising fee because we're giving them big advertisements today, Mitchell.
I think so.
Hey, man, this has been great. A fast-moving hour. Again, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about Eastern Shore basketball. Your book, simply the best. And you, my friend, are a wonderful guy for taking the time and are also a wonderful guy for what you put together in this book and told a story about basketball on the Eastern Shore that I really believe needs to be told, because a lot of times people think nobody can play basketball on the Eastern Shore, just a bunch of hillbillies. Well, even though I live up here, I still take it personally, and I still love the Eastern Shore. So thank you, my friend. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate all that and all the kind words. And happy to be on the show. Thanks for picking the book up and reading it.
I'm going to I'm in the process of getting a hard copy. I'm going to get some autographs. The first autograph is going to be you. I'm going to get, even if I come down there in North Carolina to get it, I'm getting a hard copy, get it all signed, because the paperback I have has been dog-eared and highlighted, and I don't think anybody can really sign this one. So,
sure, yeah, whatever works. I'll be on the shore next month. I have a little event I'm doing in Easton. The Talbot Historical Society asked me to come talk about the book on July. I think it's July 15th. That's a Friday. And then later that day, I'm going to go sell some books at Third Friday in Salisbury downtown. So I'll be around then if anybody wants to pick up a book from me then.
You may see this guy down in Salisbury or maybe in Easton.
Okay, great.
Hey, you all. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Daily Deuce. Our special guest today was Mitchell Northam, the author of the book, the great book, High School Basketball on Maryland's Eastern Shore. Again, thank you, Mitchell. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Have another great week, and we'll come back and see you again next week. Enjoy some sports. Have some fun. Take care.